So I'm KIRK Mackey. I've been a pastor in TM for almost 20 years. Now I'm with reFocusing, which is a mission section of Novo, which is a worldwide missions organization. We have over 600 missionaries around the world full-time in over 80 countries. And within the Church Next part of the ministry, we have the reFocusing team that helps churches get onto a missional pathway to turn their churches into basically missional outposts where their people live as missionaries on mission. And that's the sampling I want to give you today. So here we go. reFocusing brings you the missional pathway. And I'm excited that you're here, and welcome to you on digital as well. It's going to be a good day. That's my family. Just a quick word, just to give you, this is where I come from. My wife we've been married 26 years. She is an inner city high school teacher teaching English to kids who do not want to be there at all. Some have ankle bracelets because they're felons and all that good stuff. And she loves them and shares about Jesus after school almost every day, as she loves and mentors. She says she does about 10% English and 90% reparenting. So that's what she's doing. The kid on the right is just graduated Arizona State in the design field. He just moved home with us, which was a surprise. We were getting used to empty nest, and it's like, oh, they boomerang back, boing, here we go. But now he just got his insurance license last week and is trying to see if he's going to live into that world for a season. Who knows? So he's trying to figure it out. He's got a cushion with us. So he's actually been delightful to have back at home. The one on the left is a senior now at Baylor University. He is actually in the sports management and marketing program. He did an internship this summer with the Portland Trail Blazers. Yeah. So that's my family. Just wanted you to see where I come from. Here's the big issue. Somebody read this, please.
The gap between the church and the churchless is growing, and it appears that Christian communities of faith will struggle more than ever to engage church outsiders in the neighborhood, town, or city.
You buy that? Does that feel right?
Yeah.
David Kinnaman, President of Barna Group. There's a growing gap. We would like to say that Christendom is over, that the 1500 years where the church has been sort of the center of Europe and North America, and our cities and our culture. Pastors are revered, churches are respected. You know, Christianity is sort of held in high esteem at some level in the culture. That is rapidly disappearing. Now, our position is that Jesus is not caught off guard, that he is not throwing up his hands and saying, oh no, now what do I do? Our thesis is that there are some themes in our culture that resonate with the first 300 years of the church experience. And in many ways, we argue we're right back to where we were in the early church days. And so the techniques and the ideas and themes that come out of those first 300 years inform perhaps where we're going in the future. So the big issue is this. David Kinnaman from the Barna Group says this, that the gap between the churched and the churchless is growing, and it appears that Christian communities of faith will struggle more than ever to engage church outsiders in their neighborhood, town, or city. Team I work with, we are seeing this more and more be the case. We continue to look at the new reality is that about 20 to 30% of the population in the U.S. relates or even cares about what we're doing on Sunday mornings. It's just that what used to be a normative experience, that we all understand what church is and we're comfortable going there, is completely a different animal today. So similarly, 70 to 80% of the U.S. population doesn't care about how we do church. And the thesis that we're resonating with is that no matter how well we build and improve and make better and slicker and cooler and whatever, we're still not reaching 70 to 80% of the population. And no matter how much we invite them to come and do great events to try to connect, we're only hitting 20 to 30% of the population, and we even think that's shrinking over time. So there's been a marketing concept that we've kind of latched onto recently. There was a red ocean, blue ocean discussion, and we've kind of adapted it this way. So our churches are trying to reach a shrinking population of people who even resonate with anything that they understand church to be. And it's kind of like sharks in a feeding frenzy. There's a lot of blood in the water because we're all going after a smaller group, and I'm sad to say so many churches are growing purely by transfer growth. The church I've been involved with historically in my hometown in Texas, that has been growing every week, is growing by transfer growth every Sunday. It's exciting to see new people. It's exciting to think they're going to contribute to ministry and to the budget, but the reality is we're not making a dent in the lost people in the city. We're not making a dent in the changing the culture of our city by just taking people from some other church. So there's this shrinking population that our churches are attracting and trying to gain. Meanwhile, there's a whole blue ocean, if you will, where fish are swimming that have no connection to church, no connection to church people, no sense of understanding really what the gospel even is. And we're not connecting with them or touching their lives in any way. And that's where the missional church was born. It's just a reality check to say, with trends like this continuing, the church is in trouble and our culture's in trouble. So we're interested in a missional church, which means we're trying to get people, everyone in the church, to literally live on mission, to discover what their personal mission is, and to live into that and be empowered to live that, and then to also live corporately as the church takes some decisions about which areas they can serve best in a city that desperately needs Jesus. So we like to talk about the phrase, presencing Jesus in the city. Now we actually know theologically the Spirit is working in our cities and is already out there, but we want to inculcate the idea that every individual is a kingdom outpost in the city, living on mission in their daily lives. And instead of thinking the church is where the activity is, we're pushing the idea that as you live on mission, this is church out here. As you rub up, and we use this over and over, the idea of life on life, over and over serving the same lost people and literally loving them into a relationship with Jesus and earning the right to be heard.
That's it.
Is earning the right to be heard. We've been talking a lot and giving answers to questions they're not asking. In a world where we want to stand on the truth and a culture doesn't believe in truth, we're going to have to do it differently. And so we're all about loving and serving, and eventually lost people will ask, why are you doing this? And you'll say something like, this is the stuff that Jesus would do. And now you're having a conversation. So it's a church committed in the missional idea where people live as missionaries in their sphere of influence, and it's empowering people for ministry instead of essentially providing religious goods and services for people to consume at the church. And sadly, churches that get further along in their life cycle, pastors become dispensaries, if you will, of religious goods and services and entertainment and essentially club mentality instead of training people for mission. Does this make sense? Okay. So one of the questions we ask when we come into a church who's thinking about the missional pathway, I want to spend some time with the key leaders, key elders, the key deacons, etc., and we ask this question. If you could choose, and God blessed it, how would you most like to see the unchurched in your community be different 5 years from now because of the influence of your church? And that question will give us an insight into whether they're really thinking they want to live like missionaries or not. Now, just for the sake of this room, just, if I threw that out there, if you think about your own church context, think about the unchurched in your city. Essentially, what are the wounds, hurts, and needs that if you could bless and touch their lives, what would be different? So we've asked that question in a number of different churches we've talked with, and we get things like this. Some would say unwed teenage mothers are in our community, and we'd love to see that challenge met head on, to love on them, to emotionally and resource them, and do it tangibly, etc. Suburban housewives, abuse of prescription drugs, we'd love to see that drop by 40% if we could love in that particular slice of our city. Even seniors in nursing homes who are lonely and estranged would find friendship, hope, and companionship. And underneath all of these, of course, is the assumption that over time they're moving towards Jesus and finding the Lord blessing their lives, filling them, and changing them. But we're going to love them into the kingdom, and we're going to attack these issues in our city. That's the idea. So Matthew 28 says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go and make disciples of all nations, baptize them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teach them to obey everything I have commanded, and surely I am with you always. Right? So as part of the workshop, we make sure that we put this verse clearly up in front. And it's amazing to me to see the statistics of how actually so many churches still don't really resonate. This is not the core of what they're about. So part of what we're doing is getting back to these basics, that Jesus gave us a mission, and he told us to go, and go wherever we're going. 2 Corinthians 5:18, Paul says that God reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation, that God was reconciling the world to himself in Christ, not counting people's sins against them. And he has committed to us the message of reconciliation. So we are therefore Christ's ambassadors. We have found that on their own, Christians rarely become these kinds of ministers of reconciliation, that they have a hard time owning that idea and living into that until we really help reshape the DNA of a church, help them really understand their identity, their gifting, and then resource them to live like that. So the missional pathway really provides the process, the perspective, and the path to move together in that process. So again, if you are thinking about going into a missional paradigm shift, our process is kind of the how we can jumpstart and get a church to begin to really lean into this direction. And as you see in the exercises we'll do today, I think you can imagine if my people were going through this, what that would do to them and how this can work. So we're going to experiment with it as we go along today. We believe that Jesus is the only hope for a broken world, and that our cities need Jesus desperately. He delivers that hope through his people. So we've got to get our people into the lives of the lost who are broken, who are hurting. And I know that there's been a lot of emphasis along the generations that we must withdraw and stay separate from the people. But I see Jesus' whole motif and mission and the way he lived as always being with the wrong people. He was always life on life with the people who needed him most. And he was gracious to them. He was always upset with the over-churched and the overly religious. But he was gracious and loving and merciful to the lost and the broken. And we want to train our people to live like that. Then we can imagine San Bernardino becoming transformed. We can imagine Covina being shaped. And we can imagine our cities beginning to become places where the gospel takes root and people are living like missionaries. And we begin to see people coming into faith and being transformed. And we'd love to see cities be transformed as the gospel takes root. So we want to see God's reign unleashed, impacting neighborhoods and nations, and clearly the next generation as well. So that's what we're about. So the missional pathway, as this graphic dictates, is actually a series of workshops, 4 of them to be exact, with also 2 trainings that also kind of give your key leaders, who will be the table coaches, when we come and do the actual process. They'll be the ones that are trained up and ready to go, who've experienced it, so they can help others at the table experience it as well. So our purpose is to awaken what we believe is a missional DNA in the heart and soul of every believer. Because if we are the King's kids, our Father is on mission, and he's got that DNA in us already. We're here to awaken what's already been planted in us. And we're excited about that. So the first part of the missional pathway is the Awaken Workshop, which we will come and share with you. It's Awakening to My Story. So just imagine a church filled with Christians that are awakened and activated to live their missional calling. Can you imagine every person in your church who knows what distinctive group of lost people they are prepared for by God to literally love and serve until they walk in the kingdom? And if everyone was living into that reality, how fun church would be. Amen. We would not be spectators. We would definitely be participants in God's mission. And we have this vision that we would come to church, if you will, on Sundays or weekends or whatever it looks like in your context, to receive so we can be filled up to go back so we can live on mission. Because the action is in the week as we're living for Jesus amongst the lost. And we gather to get filled and encouraged, and that we come kind of almost spent and bedraggled because we've been living so hard for Jesus. We're here to get filled and to be encouraged, to be sent back out. We're coming into the huddle to go back and play the game instead of the weekend being the game. We envision people living on mission. So this is where we're going to go in the next few minutes. We're going to awaken to our past, we're going to awaken to my present, and then to my future. And then we leave with people coming out of the workshop with literally a personal calling statement that begins to inculcate some different values and ideas and issues as they begin to realize that this is who God made me to be and who I'm supposed to serve. So, Romans 13:11 says, "You know how late it is, the time is running out. Wake up, for the coming of our salvation is nearer now than when we first believed." And in Revelation 3:2, a similar theme shows up. Wake up, strengthen what little remains, for even what is left is almost dead. So Awaken Workshop is this idea of let's wake up to who God is and who He's made us to be, and then figure out where He wants us to be deployed as we live for Him. So Ephesians 2:8-9 is a key part of our ministry, and then verse 10 as well. Ephesians 2:8-9, it says, "For it is by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not from yourselves, it is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast." I hung on to that verse when I was young as one of the bedrocks of my salvation. But I never seemed to read the finishing thought in verse 10, where it says, "We are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do." I always just thought salvation was kind of an isolated event, and when you read the full thought, you realize I'm saved to be a blessing.
Yes.
I'm saved for a mission. And I'm not doing the mission to be saved. It's what saved people do, is they live on mission. It's the privilege. And then we get to, when it's all said and done, we'll be with the Lord forever. But while on earth, we're to be figuring out, well, what good works has God prepared in advance for each of us to do? And so the Awaken process leans very heavily into figuring out, well, what has God put in us? And where have we been and what's He up to? That I might discover that. So, what would it look like to live that out? So in the workshop, we have people sitting around the tables talking through the implications of Ephesians 2:10 in their world. And how might that impact your interaction with other people? And then we spend some time in Jeremiah 29:11, where it says, "I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." And the interesting thing about that word future, aharit, which is the Hebrew word, is it has this idea of your future is related to your past. Because God's got you on a continuum, and so where you're headed is a function of partly what God has been doing in your past. So we want to figure out, well, where have I been, and what has God been up to, and what's He preparing me for? And then we spend time on this verse, Jeremiah 29:7. Remember, the Israelites are in Babylon, and they're not amongst a bunch of great, wonderful, godly, church-going people. And in that context, He says to them, Jeremiah 29:7, "Seek the peace and the prosperity of the city to which I've carried you into exile, and pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, so you too will prosper." And we talk about, so what does seek the peace actually mean? Does that mean just look out the window and I'm looking for it out there? And we come to the conclusion together around the tables that it means to actually live and go out and make peace happen, to seek the blessing of our city by serving in it and loving people out there, not just in our churches on the weekend. So here's what we're going to do. To listen to our past, we're going to do a little exercise that's actually a main part of the Awaken Workshop that looks into where we have been and what God has been up to. So for the next few minutes, I'm going to pass out some little yellow Post-it notes, and for about 10-15 minutes, I want you to think about every significant person, event, and circumstance in your life that has shaped you to make you who you are today. Okay? They can be just any type and stripe. And I'm going to prompt you a little bit as we get going, but I just want you to brainstorm as fast as they come out of your head. People, places, and things, if you will. Circumstances, situations that were wonderful, situations that were difficult, all the above. You just throw them down. And the idea is to put one item per Post-it note. Okay? And it may just be a word or two. It may be a person's name. It could just be a place, a town, a city, a school, a job, you name it. But just begin to get them down as fast as you can, and as soon as you write one per note, slap it on the table, and I'm looking for 50, like in the next 10 minutes, like that fast, okay? We're just going to let it rip. So I'm going to pass them out to you, and here we go. Questions? Make sense? So I've just added another color to the equation. Pink is going to represent painful events. So I'd like for you to take any of the items that are on yellow that also were painful at the time it happened, and I'd like for you to transfer, if you will, sort of rewrite that one on a pink note and discard the yellow one at that point. So now we're separating, and then any further events that you're recollecting that were painful at the time. Now, as good theologians, I know that you know that God works all things together for good, and that you could say, well, it doesn't matter now, everything's fine, I'm good, I'm healed, whatever. But that's not the issue. If it was painful at the time, we like to say if it was an owie at that moment, it's pink. We're going to look for a moment at turning points. And turning points are the critical events and transitions that completely change the trajectory of your life in some way. Okay? They can be a profound accomplishment or a fulfillment of something, and then you finished college or graduate school, and then suddenly you got a job in another part of the country, and the whole trajectory of your life went in a different direction. And you got a new job or a new church or something, and all of a sudden it's another shift into a different direction. So it could be a sweeping change in relationship or health or finances or vocation. For some, a major injury is a completely reorienting of their life in a different direction. That would be a turning point. Or it could be a very significant painful loss that again sends your life in a totally different direction. Over the course of our lives, we posit there's probably 2 to 4 key transitions that are there. And often there can be great learning and great insight because a whole new shift has taken place, a new perspective has awakened, something has drastically changed. For example, in this person's storyline, God could use me in ways I never believed possible is a learning that comes out of that season where a major change or shift took place. Another one was, I will not allow circumstances to define me. Okay, huge life learning. Perhaps I'm not responsible for the things that God never assigned to me. That's a huge learning. Here's another one. Taking ownership of my failures is often the first step towards success. So I'd like for you just for a few moments just to be thinking, and in the workshop we spend quite a bit of time around some of these key ideas. We're just compressing all of this down very quickly for you today. But we spend hours working through a lot of these issues with your people. I'd like for you to just see if you could come up with a couple of key learnings, perhaps around those turning points, things that God taught you, some life lessons that have really shaped and you really grab onto today. And if you'd put those on a blue note at the bottom underneath, which is why we left a little space at the bottom, just kind of line up with some of the key learnings. Now you may have some other key learnings that you've figured out that may not be around a turning point, but we have found that as life makes a major right or left turn in the turning points, a lot of learning takes place around that. See if the Lord can reveal some things. We take 5 minutes and reflect on that for a few moments. Okay? So your people are going to be talking amongst themselves and sharing some of this stuff. And then right after a break, we come back. In fact, just as a comment, we usually do this on the Friday night. So this is the Awaken workshop is the longest. It's a 9-hour deal. It's a Friday night and then a Saturday. So we do this whole thing on Friday night for about 2 hours. We come back the next morning and we do a deep dive on processing the pain. And this is a very sacred time. Right? And we actually work through some ideas. I'm going to go through just very fast with you, but this is what we really camp on for part of it. That pain is unavoidable, that in the middle of it we rarely understand why we're going through it. Right? It doesn't, and it often yet produces some of the greatest insights. And that God can use those things if we're willing to like you said, kind of reframe it a little bit, look at it through a different lens, and we realize God's still in that and redemptively using that in some way. And his intent is, of course, never to waste our pain. So we spend some time working through those principles in the big group with everyone. And then we begin to imagine that perhaps God has a purpose for the pink Post-it notes. Of course, Romans 8:28, we work through that a little bit. We know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love and are called according to his purpose for them. That verse doesn't say that everything that happens is good, but that God makes good out of things that are painful. We also then work through a whole thing on the paralysis of pain, why we get stuck in our lives, why we're afraid to go forward. We work through unforgiveness and resentment and suspicion and distrust. We actually have a very deep prayer time where we actually collectively start to wrestle with this stuff and let some of this stuff go. We've had people actually have major healing moments in our workshops and come up afterward and say, oh my God, like I finally get it and I can go forward, and then they'll say things like, God's always been telling me I should be serving this group of people, and I've been, and then they let it go. And suddenly they're game on. So I'm just walking through. We actually work through this whole recognizing, renouncing, repenting, reframing, and realigning process that's really powerful. And then we also do this little dive on this thing called the 3 lenses. And we have 3 ideas that that painful points can have 3 different ways of looking at them. One, that they can be spiritual formation and character development opportunities. Another would be that they are for guidance and direction. Or they are for deepening and clarifying values. Like, because you experience something painful, you realize, I don't want to be like that. Or I've seen this and I'm not going there. Well, that's a clarifying values. Dad abandoned us. Boy, I'm going to be committed to my kids in a way that, right? So so you can reframe some of these and realize there's learnings and positives, if you will, that shape you because of it. So what we actually have you do is, if you would go back and see if you can find one of each on some of your pinks just for a moment. And if you just put a little C, a G, or a V, which is character, guidance, or values. For example, in this one, some mother's illness was a character thing for that person. An unsuccessful vocational transition suddenly was really painful, but it gave them a whole new guidance because God opened up a whole new part of their life for a whole new direction. And then a family crisis can shape values in a deep way. So we are going to shift gears now. So that whole thing represents the timeline, the processing, the pain, and all of that stuff. That is done over multi-hours, carefully Spirit-invoked, Spirit-led process. And then we shift gears and we start working into what's called the personal calling statement, which is a concise articulation of your specific calling as a follower of Jesus. It's all about your unique, Jason Evans, your spiritual DNA, Mark Barguer, your spiritual, each one of us uniquely called, prepared to make a missional difference. And it has 3 components. There's a values component, there is an identity component, and there's also an impact. Basically, what do you value? Who are you biblically? And then what impact are you called to make? And the impact is, what difference are you called to make in the lives of the unchurched? Okay? Again, we're back to Ephesians 2:10. We are God's masterpiece. That word is poema, right? It means poem, or that's the word we used from the word poem. It's the masterpiece, the piece of art, etc., right? He has formed you beautifully to do something beautiful in His world. And I just love to raise the tension of, what is that? Do you know what that is? And to each of our congregants, each of our people, what would happen if each of them figured that out and lived on mission? You have a unique set of values, and part of the workshop is that we spend some time on this values discussion, because awareness of those brings courage. Courage enables you to envision a future in line with God's call. So we want to help you figure out what some of your real values are, and then clarify those. And even if you don't like what some of them really are, then you can make some changes because values are expressed not in what you just say, but it's in what you do, right? Values show up in your behavior, okay? So they are core convictions that show up in decisions and real activity in the world. So as it says, they're in behavior, not in a belief system. So we want you to begin thinking about the way that God has shaped you. And some sample values are, like, for example, some of these: efficiency, or creativity, or trust, or risk, justice, security, innovation, family, control, fairness, relationships, learning. Here's some values like generosity and what it means. When I give myself and my resources away, I get much more in return. A shared life. My life in Christ is established and perpetuated in community with God and His creation. To live well is to live interdependently with God and others. For somebody else, self-care is one of their core values. And that just means they live a life of regular exercise, a healthy diet, rest, soul care, things like that keep my soul, at my best. So I want you to do this. If you look over your timeline, just for a moment, see if you can identify 2 or 3 values that emerge from your behaviors and experiences in your timeline. For example, one of mine is I just value mentoring and that kind of learning relationships. And when you look in my timeline, it's just, I have all these mentors that have poured into me, and I have been so shaped by that. I love that. And that's what I do. A lot of my ministry now is in these coaching, mentoring kinds of relations. It's just been a deep value for me for a long time. And it shows up in my timeline with people who've poured in and then watching me pour it back out. It's just what I do. Yeah. Okay? So, and Mark, you've seen that in other people. That's just kind of how I roll. Yeah. It's one of my values. And it's part of my gifting, and it showed up in my timeline. And so I have to take that very seriously as I think about, well, what impact do I get to make in this kingdom thing? See if you can find 2 or 3 values, and see if you can write down somewhere, what that value means to you. In the workshop, we spend, a good 20, 30 minutes wrestling through values and helping your people clarify what those look like as part of their personal calling statement. So we take a couple moments, see if you can find 2 or 3 in your timeline, and then I want you just to turn in pairs. Actually, we'll do it just in pairs, just really quickly. When we're done with the Awaken workshop, these things are in place. They've come up with their value statements, they've wrestled with their biblical identity statement, and they've also worked on their personal impact. Mm-hmm. And once those 3 have been laid down, they leave the workshop after 9 hours with this on paper, clarified, and at least kind of rough draft and a little bit of feedback already. And they're leaving with a pretty robust sense of, wow, God's been up to something. And they're pretty excited. And essentially, then we come back about a month or 6 weeks later and do the the Activate workshop, which follows on the heels of the Awaken. Everything was discerned in the first one. We're now going to put into practice, and we literally call it Activate instead of Deliberate. Because we're not just going to talk about it and write some things in a workbook and put it on the shelf. By the end of that workshop, they are going to actually leap into this new missional future and do some irreversible items that gets the ball rolling, which is a lot of fun. So that's where so now we're stepping into the second workshop called Activate. And it entails something called the jump. The whole theme of this is about leaping off of a high dive. So the whole paradigm we're playing around with it. What's it like to get up on top of the high dive, look out there? Have you ever felt that feeling? The irreversible, I'm now finally taking off from the board. I'm going in. We help you figure out who's around you in your community to help you get more clear on what you're supposed to do and how to do it. We walk you through the step grid, which we're going to do in just a few moments. We then circle around what's the one thing that you can do that'll make an impact to start your missional future. We then will send you off for 15 minutes into what's called the action zone. And the action zone is literally a time when you have your cell phone and your texts and your computer and so forth, and you actually do what it is and start the ball rolling on that missional engagement. So if you've been talking about I should stop doing this and start doing this, in the action zone, you send the email that says I'm leaving this, and please put me on the list for this. Let's talk about how I get involved. And before they leave the workshop, they started the ball. And it's amazing the conversations and the giddiness and the fearfulness and everything that erupts as they realize, oh my goodness, I just did it. Because we're not interested in just ideas. We want to see action. So, we won't do it here, but I've got some of these little called solarium cards where we spend some time, looking at these little pictures, trying to imagine what it's like to live into your missional future. So we have lots of exercises that have hands-on, working with right brain, left brain, just trying to capture different parts of their personality to get them involved in imagining some of these things. Okay? So what we're going to wrestle with here, though, is if you now have your values, your identity, and your personal impact statement, you've created that in the Awaken workshop, and it's all clear on paper, and you're bringing it back to Activate. We want to get you focused and faithful and even fruitful and living in a fulfillment when you live like that. The question becomes, how do you go from one side to the other? And we've found there's a tool called the Step Grid that actually helps you make the adjustments to live on the right side of this grid here. And it comes from computer terminology of STEP referring to save, trash, edit, and paste. Okay? And the idea is, if you were to sit down with Jesus right now, what changes, deletions, or new activities might he invite you to consider, given now that you've clarified your personal calling statement, you've got some clarity on what kind of missional initiative you ought to be engaged in, with whom, and what the difference would be to have it take place. So how are we going to get there? So in your little notebook there, or on your paper, I want you to take a couple minutes, given what we've been wrestling with. What should you keep doing is the save, right? What's the action, and how will it help? What will I stop doing is the T for trash. What am I going to get rid of out of my life to be more faithful to the calling I'm now clearer about? Okay? What will I do differently is the edit function. And paste, what should I begin to do as I think about what needs to be realigned? Okay? In the workshop itself, we do some examples of this in other people's lives, and they get an idea of how it works, and then we drill down and we actually get them to take some serious time reflecting on this. So I just for 2 minutes, just for your own reflections there, as you think about your own personal calling, some things you need to do, stop doing, see if you can take a few moments to just fill that out, and it'll give you an idea what it feels like in the workshop to experience that as well. The Step Grid is a powerful tool just to begin to think critically and strategically about what should I keep, what should I change, edit, etc. So what happens next in the workshop is, as you've worked through your Step Grid individually, you work with a partner, you listen to each other's Step Grid, and you begin to determine together, figuring out kind of mutual coaching back and forth, what's the one best thing that will launch you into action to get your initial missional calling underway. And you negotiate that back and forth, and there's a whole process that takes about an hour and a half to dial that down. And they get committed to it, right? And then we play around with some verses about, in the same way faith by itself, if it is not accomplished by action, accompanied by action is dead, said James 2:17. And then again we come into, what is the one thing you can do right now that's irreversible to get this thing started? So here's some examples, and we give some examples before they go off and do this. So my one thing is going to be refocus my work with junior high students from the church youth group to my daughter's soccer team, which is right up what we're just talking about. That kind of like, woo, I'm going to make a shift. So my action zone leap, when I go into my 15 minutes, I'm going to call the youth pastor, set a time to develop a plan to transition from ministry to youth at church to ministry to youth outside the church on the soccer team. Okay? I'm going to email the coach asking for a time to meet to discuss which girls have the greatest needs for support and encouragement. And I'm going to send a Facebook message asking my daughter to help me think of ways to support her teammates. All that can be done in 15 minutes with a phone and a computer and a Wi-Fi. Right? And so the idea is that's what they've clarified. And in the moment we say go, they run off and they go do that.
I love the number 3.
Somebody else did this one. My one thing is to expand my sphere of relationships with the unchurched in my neighborhood. My action zone leap is to email one unchurched neighbor and invite them over for dinner next weekend. Call Mrs. Alvarez number 2 to volunteer to help our neighbors with the community garden. And then off they go. They actually send the emails, and then they come back. And after we do this exercise, we then actually we share what's going to happen. They go do it. It better be courageous. We want to make sure we're not, wimping out. It's got to be real, bold, and irreversible. And then we send them off to make the phone call and to sweat a little bit, and whatever happens, right? And they come back after the 15, 20 minutes, And people are giddy, like, oh my gosh, it happened. And some of them actually get responses like immediately, like, yes, we'll do that, and oh my goodness, yes. And then we share those around the room. We just have about half an hour where we start listening to the actual leaps that happened, affirming each other, calling it out. And it's pretty powerful, especially some of them are really bold. Now, we do this whole thing about how a lot of, like, look, when you get up to bat as a ball player, there's a couple different ways you can approach it. You can swing, right? And there's some chances you're going to hit a single, double, triple, home run, or you could foul out or strike out. But at least there's real opportunity for something to happen. We men make this whole shtick about how a lot of Christians get up to the plate and they square off to bunt. And they play safe. And they line up to bunt. And really all that bunt's going to do is either you're going to strike out, foul out, or at least it's only going to be maybe a single. And we're challenging people. Jesus wants you to swing for the fence. Get up to swing. And so we challenge them. Go bold. Swing. Go to that action zone. Swing. Right? And some come back with some pretty amazing things that begin to start. So the workshop concludes with this sense of we've done something irreversible. We're moving into that missional future. And we're encouraging each other. And then we actually finish with everybody getting on the symbolic diving boards around the room.
I love it.
Pray about what it is, and then they all leap off,
That's
each
good.
one. And they leap. So the whole room's got people praying and leaping
I love
into their
it.
future.
Yeah.
In a ball pit.
Right? And that ends
That's too comfortable.
Yeah.
the Awaken workshop. So then what happens typically is we take another couple months off. Sometimes if you start in the process in the winter, we've done, say, some training in January, February. We might run a workshop in March, might run one in end of April or the first part of May. Usually take the summer off, and then we get it, training in August, September, and maybe the next one at the end of October. So that's how kind of the year typically rolls out. Or if we start in September, we have then Christmas break, and then we come back after the first of the year. So now we're switching to assess, and now we're going corporate. Okay, we've been doing individual. My timeline, my learnings, and then my action leap in my personal sphere. Now we're going to assess the church, the city, and eventually figure out what missional initiatives will this church corporately do to serve the same lost people over and over and over, not in the way of gestures, which are one-off events that we churches are famous for doing and feeling good about ourselves.
Yeah.
But doing committed action repeatedly over and over, same lost people, that we might change their lives and see Jesus manifested in their lives. Make sense? So it starts off looking at our mission journey, which is understanding the history of your particular church and its relationship to the city. And so essentially we do the timeline exercise on the wall with the whole church. Looking at its relationship, not just the highs and lows of the church, but looking at its dance with the city.
Right.
Has it been engaged? When did it pull back? When was it in good relationship? When was it in rocky water? And we look at that as, and especially older churches that have lots of history, you can see this thing coming up and down, right?
Yeah.
So that's the mission journey. Then we wrestle with who are we in our demographic in our church? And who in the city is actually have some similarity that we can actually make the connection. Because we often notice how many times churches, when they do venture into the city to do something missional, they make huge leaps across multiple barriers that there's really no way for them to successfully make the good connection. And these people are so different from these people and don't understand their needs, their hurts, their desires, their dreams, or even their language. And so we're trying to figure out who's more similar that we can connect with to make an easy win, because we're trying to build success as we connect with lost people. As we mature in mission, you can start making more stretches further in. But we're just trying to get people just to make an easy connect, right, as we go. So we'll discern the mission field. We'll then figure out exactly what it is we could be doing, and then we'll have a surrender process where we give the church back to Jesus. And we culminate the workshop in a very powerful spiritual exercise after sending them on a prayer walk and really wrestling with what does the Lord want to do here and laying down my agenda because we all bring our hopes and dreams of what we hope our church will do, and I hope it lines up with what I want it to do, and we have to lay it down at the feet of Jesus. Ephesians 2:10 again. So what if your church, we play around with the idea, what if your church is God's provision for your city? That the needs and the hurts, you're the one that's supposed to be the balm, the salve, the healing agent for your city. Okay? And he's preparing your church for that relationship with the city. Okay? And we're going to examine what that looks like. So we also talk about how a lot of churches assume that the city is there for them. That the people are supposed to come to us to fill up our programs and to make our church healthy and successful. And we flip it and say, your church is the blessing for the city and its hurts and needs. Okay? We come back to Jeremiah 29:7 again. We wrestle with blessing the people around us who are not the good church-going folk, but whom the Lord loves and wants redeemed. Okay? So then we ask the question, in your local relationship with your church with the city, which events, circumstances, people, and experiences have been most significant? Okay? So what we do is we do the same exercise, which I'm not going to make you do right now, but you get the idea. So what's been happening with us and the city at each individual church? And we put them on cards, and we do a timeline on a big section of wall in the room wherever we're meeting. And we actually look at it. So positive items are going to be on the yellows, and we do pink for the painful ones. Right? Sound familiar? So we're doing a timeline visually with everybody at the tables generating items, and then we have a process to filter them down and get them all up there on the wall. We get rid of the duplicates, but we make sure. And by the way, pastors, your job as we start this exercise is we prime you to put the great big pink one, the big kahuna issue that nobody wants to talk about, you put it up there. Right? The elder that got arrested, it goes up there, right? I mean, whatever it is.
It's not a good standing.
Right? All the big, because we all want to dance. We're going to have to just look at it, right? So you, pastor, put up the big one, or the one or two, right? Yeah. But then you're saying to the church, we're going to talk. Yeah. It's okay.
The big elephant.
That's right.
Under the carpet
you bet.
Years.
It's going on the wall.
We're talking. Yeah.
So I've done this in many churches that are very insular, who now have a pastor trying to be missional, but their history, as you look at it on the wall, is really insular. We do everything for us, and they might have a one-off here. Back in 1963, we tried this, and then in '74, we tried this once, and that's about it, And then, but then part of the learning is we all sit there and look at the empty wall.
Yes, powerful.
And you let it sit. And as a consultant, I got no dog in this hunt, so I'm just there to.
Hey, I'm just.
Right, we're just processing.
Hey.
To snowstorm in
Love it.
Texas.
And so maybe the big blue note is we haven't been engaged at all.
Love it.
Yeah. So again, you see. So here's a typical timeline of a church now. From 1920 we started. Now it's 215 or whatever. Yeah. And again, you do the yellows and the pinks on the wall. Yeah. But again, to clarify, this is not about our own internal health. Like we hired, Pastor so and so, and we got a bigger choir that year, and then we bought the organ. We're not talking about that stuff. It's not it's a look of our dance relationship with our city. What have we done? How open our mission? How open are we to the city? What events have we done in partnership? Or maybe there's none, like you said, or very little. Yeah. Just like we did with the individual timeline, we also look at turning points. So we draw great big circles up there on the wall. Where did we make major shifts? They'll identify, this leader helped us really engage the city, and for 15 years we really were. Then the next leader came, and it was completely inward, or whatever dynamics happened. Or we tried an outreach, and it blew up in our face, and then we decided to never do that again, and now we went insular. But we talk about it. Turning points, shifts in focus, fruitful engagement. What did it look like when we were really ministering to the city? Right. And then when did we totally pull away, and what happened, etc. Right? And then we do the blue notes as well. What are the lessons learned? And it's really powerful. Here's some that we've seen. When we assume the church exists for our benefit, we miss God's heart for those in need. That came up in one of them. Yeah. When we focus our energies, we can make a significant impact on our city. And when the people are learning and discerning these, those are the most powerful part of this part of the exercise, is the blue note learning as the pastors walk. And I usually give the microphone at this point to the pastor and let the pastor process this stuff with his people. It's really powerful. I made that up along the way and realized it's better for the key leader to do it than me.
Yeah.
Because this is his people. And they can talk about that hard thing or that key learning, without my influence. I step aside.
Yeah.
So we do the same thing. You put the blue notes up on the wall. It's really powerful. It looks like this, right? So my colleague Randy Steele, that's a church down in the Huntington Beach area. Oh, no, sorry, Newport Beach area. You can see pinks and yellows along the way. Here's my pastor in Conroe, Texas. We had lots of great blue notes and really rich learnings that came out of that exercise. Yeah. And that wall went for a good, it was 50 feet or something. It was big. We had a big wall, lots of material up on the wall. And we left it up for a few weeks in that room so that people could come by and see it and reflect on it. And, it's part of the strategies. Let these things sit for a while up there. So we asked the question, does your history demonstrate a greater focus on Christ's mission or on self-care?
Yeah.
And we have this conversation,
Wow.
okay, as a church, okay? And if your church was suddenly closed, would anybody notice?
Yeah.
Right? Except our people feeling like, oh no.
We have no place to go.
Right. But would the city notice? Would they care?
Yeah.
We're wrestling with, okay, we're assessing, right? What would you change about your history with the city if you could? And you'll get bold people saying, boy, I wish we were more of this and that. It's cathartic. It's a big therapy session of trying to, where have we been, where are we going? Let's reconcile, let's figure this thing out, let's grieve, let's move on, whatever we have to do. But it's a powerful experience. And then we ask these questions. 10 years from now, the mayor and the city council want to honor your congregation. Okay? What would that look like for them to do that? So we're trying to get them to imagine, that's right, the city blessing you for your hard work in doing something really significant to change the culture of our city. Because God loves this city, and He wants those people found, right? So there's some exercises to do that. We're not going to do that right now, but I'm just, again, showing you what the exercises are that people go through. Okay, so we've gone through these verses again. Now, we do talk a little bit about the worst ways to be on mission.
You don't use any church names.
And we don't throw names out, but they include things like knowing lots about ourselves, knowing very little about our city itself, keeping it impersonal. We give our stuff and not ourselves. And I spend a little bit of time as the consultant giving examples of these kinds of one-off things that we do. And you'll see them on the timeline, We do this, once a year holiday kind of thing that keeps us busy, but doesn't really have any impact because no lost people are getting found as a result of all this stuff. Or examples how we'll minister to the homeless and we'll make bag lunches and we'll give them away once a month to people that we never see again. And we feel good, but it's a one-off and it's a gesture. It's not a committed relationship. It's a committed relationship when I go to the same homeless shelter and I work with the same homeless guy weekly and I build a friendship and we have conversations and then we start talking about Jesus and I actually help him find a job and get now we're having a relationship. That's different. So we have to discern the differences in that. Okay? We also go to those who can't relate to us at all.
Mm-hmm.
So when we finally sometimes try to do something, we go really too far. Mm-hmm. Because we're being just really adventurous all of a sudden, but it doesn't make sense because they're not going to receive that from you. There's no connection whatsoever. In fact, there may even be a lot of distrust between the two parties for various reasons. Or we just go unprepared. So the idea is we want to conceive of mission from the perspective of the receivers of the ministry. What do they want and need, and what's helpful for them? Then what we think they need, and we bring it without ever really checking, is this helpful?
Yeah.
It's been fascinating to do this exercise and to hear people, we could do this for the city, and you realize that's because we like it, we want it.
Make us look good.
But they don't need that, want that. It's not even helpful.
Yeah.
And we go on mission trips, and we bring cloth shoes down to people who live in rainforest, and we feel good about giving them shoes.
To go talk to the community and ask them what they...
No, but before this thing's over, Actually, at Assess, before this thing even starts, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
you've already had city leaders being interviewed. We're learning what the needs already are.
Yeah.
And we're going to post those as well. So we're finding out. So as part of the Assess process, you have key leaders in your church researching. You'll have them in the mayor's office, city council, chief of police, fire department,
Yeah.
principals of
I was
schools,
gonna say school district.
all that kind, and you come back with all this data of what they're saying.
Right.
I had one church that actually got a hold of somebody in the state council, whatever. Yeah, and they came in and did a presentation on the weekend. It was amazing.
Well, it's done.
Yeah, and they actually said these are the most important needs in this whole part of the city of Philadelphia. Had to do with after school programs and relating to kids who were just running the streets.
Yeah.
Then we found out this church whose name was Youth Connect. It's like, right? Okay, hello.
Yeah.
But they were still thinking, get people to our church. And I was helping them realize, get this church into the city streets where the kids are. Right?
Yeah.
And now they're living on mission. It's really exciting. But it took them a good couple years of working through this to make the leap. It's
Yeah.
really neat. So here's what we do. We're trying to find people that are most receptive to the kind of ministry we could bring. And so this is actually the most controversial part, but we're just because we're trying to make easy wins. Because our people who are so afraid, we got to make them connect to somebody that's easy to connect with on the outside. Okay? We need to understand the community's composition, its needs, concerns, barriers, opportunities. Issachar, right? The men of Issachar understood the times, and they knew what they should do. Right? Comes out of 1 Chronicles. So we want to be wise in terms of what we're doing in our city. So we actually then, before the Assess workshop, your team will have gathered a whole series of hard and soft demographics. And we have this part of the workshop, this is all presented by the pastor. This is our city, this is what's going on, these are the needs, this is what we've learned, here's what's up, and it all comes out. This is particular, this is just what it looks like, right? A church, all these kind of, here's the median age of the city, what's married, divorced, college, this and that, blah, blah, blah. Who's working, what's going on. Turns out this particular church discovered they had the highest suicide rate in the U.S.
Wow.
I forgot where this was, but that was just what emerged in the data.
Washington?
I forget what it was, actually. Meanwhile, they discovered our congregation is over 55, strong Christian beliefs, right, middle income, ready. So where can we make some connection here?
Yeah.
And sometimes it's very difficult because you realize the community and the church are completely different.
Yeah.
So we're trying to find what is some of that overlap where there's enough that we can make some wins.
A natural oikos.
A natural oikos, a natural connection. Next part starts. We draw then, we have this little illustration. We call it the beach ball exercise, which I'm not going to make you do in the interest of time. But the idea is everybody at the tables draws, we ask the question, who is the largest demographic group in your church? And they mean, well, which demographic? Like, well, you figure it out, however you want to slice it. But what's the biggest group in your church? And then give me 6 or 8 terms to describe them. And so on this big piece of butcher paper, they draw this big church, 2 great big beach balls, and they start to fill in. They agree together around the table. Well, it's these kind of people or this kind of people, and they're this, okay. And they struggle. Then we say, what's the second largest group in your church? Now, some churches, it breaks down by age. The largest group is over 55. The other group is under 35. That might be one slice. Another version of it is actually, the largest group is Spanish and English speaking, over 55. Like, okay, now we're doing language kinds of things. You can cut that in multiple different ways. But we have every table analyzing your own church and getting clarity of what is really in who we are. So what it looks like on the wall is eventually all the tables put up their version of the exercise. And we explain and we begin to discern, okay, really who are we? Okay? And it's one thing to read statistics, another thing to sort of see it like this, and you realize, right, this is who we are. This is at Alhambra, and they, Asian, Latina, or Latino was one variation of how they sliced that up. Another group said, well, it's over 55, and then Asians was the second group. And somebody else thought it's over 55 seniors, and they kept having different interpretations, but they all gave some truth about what's really going on. The missional leadership team who's running your whole process is collecting all this data.
Yeah.
You're taking pictures of all these, taking a picture of the big wall, you're taking pictures of all this, because your missional leadership team that's driving the process is going to collate all this data and put a report together to explain all that we've learned together. And at the end, we'll present it before we execute and live into it, okay? We know there's going to be challenges out there, but the assess is a deep dive in the city and our church, and we're just trying to figure out where could we make a difference that makes sense, given who we are, who they are. So for example, one church here in Southern California went through our process. They realized that inside their church, they had a lot of law enforcement related people. Detectives and cops and sheriffs and all that kind of stuff. They also noticed that there are 3 prisons in the city itself. They said, So who did they select to minister to? Not the inmates. Who do you think they went after? Prison guards. So they go to the prison and they said, we're the so-and-so church and we're here to bless the prison guards. The warden says, in the 22 years I've been here,
Yeah.
churches come and go loving on the prisoners. Nobody has ever come to love on the prison. And this guy's got tears in his eyes. He's not a crier, big guy, right? He's just weeping. Nobody's ever cared for prison guards. Now again, why would you not want cops connecting with prisoners? Because prisoners don't like cops. So it doesn't make sense for a law enforcement driven church to be ministering to inmates. Because that's, again, we could go minister to them. Well, does that feel good from their perspective? We have to ask, that's the...
On both sides.
Right?
Yeah.
But cops get prison guards. So what's crazy is the first weekend they show up to bring cake pops and stuff and put it on the desks of all the prison guards just to kind of start the process, was the same weekend that the pink slips were given out because the governor was cutting back on some huge... So all of a sudden, everybody's like losing their jobs, and the Christians show up the same day. Now, only God can arrange stuff like that. So here's all these teary-eyed prison guard and assistants in the office, all of a sudden stressed out of their heads about a pink slip, and the Christians walk in the door. And they sat down and listened to them and cried with them and prayed with them, and God jump-started that ministry on that day. Then they would do barbecues for shift change and all this stuff. So over time, right, how fun is that?
Love that.
Yeah.
Shift change barbecue, right? You can get all over this stuff. So then, eventually, they discovered the prisoners are being treated better because the prison guards are getting loved on.
Yeah.
And so finally people realize it's the church people.
Yeah.
They're changing the whole character of what's happening inside this place. And slowly over time, to answer your question, slowly some of those prison guards actually gave their lives to Jesus. Was it a great big church growth, bonanza? Not so much. Slower. But you're changing the city. And it's all about Jesus. And people ask you, why are you doing this? Again, the answer is, this is the stuff Jesus does. But boy, you've earned the right to talk about that. This is missionality. It's life on life and the messiness of it all, like you said, where you're earning the right you're demonstrating the love of Jesus, and then you're talking about it later. Which is very different from the evangelical world where we've been kind of the center of attention, where we're just giving out all our truths all the time. They're not listening. So we serve our way into the conversation. Okay? So then we come to advance. And the advance is the fourth and final workshop in the process. We've got all this data. Now we're going to figure out, what are we going to do? What comes next? And then, pastors, for you to know, this is not a top-down process. It is not you going on the mountain and figuring out what we're going to do and then selling it to the people. This is discerning with the Spirit amongst the people through all these exercises, with the consultant getting out of the way, for your church to hear from the Spirit what the Spirit wants to do. And we love watching it emerge. Because when it comes up from the people, they buy it and they go after it. And then you as the pastor can reinforce what we discern together. So we talk about what did we learn on the mission journey, what turning points, what did God teach us, what the blue notes told us, right? Who's our mission field? What can we be focusing on? And what did we learn in the surrender process? Now, I didn't take you through that, but the surrender piece, again, sends people out for 35 minutes on a prayer walk. And they lay down their agenda. And they come back, and we use the paradigm from the book of Revelation, the 7 churches, where there's a word, I love this about you, but I got this beef against you. Right?
Wow.
My paraphrase. And we have them write a letter from Jesus to their church in that paradigm. I love this, but here's my struggle with you. And everybody has to wrestle with, we've not been on mission, right? And they're surrendering the church back to Jesus. And we summarize whatever we learned and all that coming into advance. So we're trying to make this a spiritual cleansing process along the way, okay? So highlights we learned about our turning points, insights, lessons, the mission field, demographics, all this stuff is presented. Now we are going to look at our community impact. What can this church do? What do we want to see happen? And what initiatives can we take on to make it happen? And just so we know, we're going to end up with 3 that emerge. And then as the missional leadership team researches it, you'll start one. And we would ask you stay on that one for at least a year before you even try number 2. Okay? We'll also talk a bit about ministry structure, which is all about people flow. We start talking about if people start coming into faith, how are they going to get integrated into your process? And what is your flow for discipleship in the journey? And we end the workshop on values. What are the strategic values that you, church, need to accomplish all this? And it's a great restart, because if they've been bold, or if they've been fearful and self-absorbed, and they start choosing to be bold and risk-taking, they own it, they vote on it, and then you have a sermon series to preach, because you can talk about, you chose these, and I'm going to hold you accountable.
Here we go.
It's great. But they come up with them, not you. And we love that process. Okay? We figure out who we're equipped to serve and the impact on their lives. Same thing we did personally. Now we're thinking about, well, what impact can we make in this city? So that we have a word picture of what that's going to look like in 3 years. In the interest of time, we're not going to have you struggle with all that right here at the tables, but I think you'll see how it works. So we're going to give you some actual impact statements that came from churches that came through our process. Okay? So WCC is part of the West LA area, and they're changing it so that the fabric of the city is changing so that those living in isolation are surrounded by the family of God. Kids and teens are coming to know Jesus, building his kingdom at home and school. Families are strengthened and are engaged in the community, actively loving and serving their neighbors. The homeless are supported and equipped, and the West Side is tearing down cultural, racial, and economic barriers. It's a lot in there. Can you also see what's in the timeline of that church and who they've got in their congregation? Because this is who they realize they can connect with. And these are the wounds and the hurts that we feel burdened for in our city. Now, what you notice is we don't know there's no how we're going to do that. At this phase, we're just getting at what do we want to see different. The how comes later. We're dreaming into what that looks like. The who and the how. Well, it's actually the who and the what, not so much the how. Another one was this. In Ontario, city leaders are confidently dependent on the resources of the body of Christ. The Eaton High School community will feel safe, equipped, and empowered. And the college students nearby have a place of connection, inspiration, and identity. That was their 3 initiatives. At the end of the day, they only went after the first one, and it blew up so big in a good way that they're now handling some of the biggest issues in the city with the city council, and they never got the other ones. It got opened up way too many doors, and now that church is running high, working every day with the city and the city officials, handling some of the biggest issues. And people in the city offices are now followers of Jesus. Changed the whole city.
Yeah, absolutely.
Totally crazy. Church of 50 did this.
Wow.
This one's about veterans, at-risk children. Okay, so then we take them on a prayer walk again. Send them back out. Go talk to Jesus. Come back in 30 minutes. We have some starter questions. Who's receptive to our ministry? What do we want to see different after we minister to them? And they come back, what does God want to accomplish in our city? They take a 30-minute prayer walk, and then we have them draw on a piece of paper at the table, big butcher paper, with the big colored markers, and you have to draw what that impact will look like in 3 years from now. Now we're teasing into the right brain again. I don't want the words, I want the picture. Who's been impacted and what difference was made? And so they share their drawings, and we won't have time to do all that today, but it looks like this. All of a sudden, everybody's sitting around the tables, they're drawing pictures. It may be that they've all come up with one item together and they agree, or it may be there's 3 or 4 things we'd like to see. Whatever works, just get it on the paper and get it up on the wall. So then we craft community impact statements. And then as we kind of come to the end of the workshop, we figure out the initiatives, the strategic initiatives that fulfill what we want to see happen. We want to see the lost and lonely and the drug abused, come to faith and to clean up their lives and become whole citizens again. Okay, so we don't know how yet, but now we start talking about what could we do to make that happen, right? To engage our mission field, and the idea is it requires the attention of the entire church. And we say the entire church, boy, if we can get a good chunk of people starting off, the pioneers really doing this thing, when it becomes safe for the belongers, they'll come on board too. But the idea is we want to get a lot of people involved. Essentially, it's a change in focus and behavior and culture of our church to live out there on mission. Okay? We talk about how they are long-term commitments, life on life, serving the same unchurched people. We've been talking about that already. Those who are open to our care, providing unconditional benefits, even if they reject us and don't come to our church, we're still going to love them. We have to get clear that we're demonstrating unconditional love. Regular repeated contact, not once a year. Ongoing. Okay?
How would you define that?
So we're hoping for at least weekly or maybe twice a month connection, as opposed to a one-off event where we go once a year to help the homeless and pass out little bag lunches once and then never see them again, and we feel like, oh, we served the homeless. No. So we kind of unpack ministries of attraction just aren't working. I mean, in the blue ocean, that 80% out there, they're just not. They're suspicious of church. They're cynical. They're fearful. So we're going to bring Jesus to them, and we're going to love them. Right? We talk about all, they think we're uptight, we're anti-everything, hypocritical, old-fashioned, too political, right? Bad experiences, so we're going to have to just love them unconditionally. They're going to be suspicious, and we're just going to keep loving, and eventually we'll wear them down with love. We want to see with giving with no strings attached. We serve where they are, love, generosity, and grace. We're building the relationships slowly, but they're authentic and they're deep. Okay? To bring Jesus to them. We also know His Spirit's already working out there. And as we show up, it's amazing what God will do when the two meet. So much fun. We think it's important to measure impact, not activity. We churches are so famous for counting how many people showed up at an event that we did. We measure our busyness and our attendance, not the actual impact we're making. And again, back to the scorecard thing, if our scorecard is impact, it changes how we think about the strat ops, unstuck, everything. So we can cater all that to whatever we're trying to measure. Just measure the right things. These are some examples of some strategic initiatives. You can adopt the school, the city hall, the senior center, the fire station. I've got a church I'm working with who's adopting the fire station as a way to really work with the seniors, because the fire people know who's hurting and who's fallen down, and it turns out the fire chief turns out to be a Christian who's welcoming this church in, and they're coming out every Saturday to bless the fire guys, and they're starting to make connections, and they're hearing about the seniors, and so it's just going like crazy. Yeah. Who knew? Because they got out of the building. Hospitals, after-school arts programs, all this kind of stuff can take place. It's fun to serve with friends, but we believe discipleship happens when we actually act like Jesus. When we actually go do the stuff, it raises new questions, right? We pray differently. We actually think that being on mission grows us up, rather than just being educated with information. So this is where a lot of discipleship takes place, as we live with people. You come back with a whole new set of experiences and questions. We then get people to figure out the strategic initiative. Everybody at the table begins to come up with, well, what could we do to accomplish what's emerging? The table will narrow the list down. So we're going to have all these ideas. The table then begins to negotiate. what the top ones are going to be. And the whole room then votes as we put them up on a wall in clusters. So myself as the consultant, I'm getting all these little cards off the tables, putting them on the wall. The whole room will vote on the top, I think 3. We tally the votes. I get to, as the consultant, pull all the ones that lost down. Everybody goes, ooh. We pull them all down. It's kind of fun to watch. We then have them figure out goals and action steps, and they go off into different rooms. And depending on which one, Jason, if you like this one, you're going to go in that room. Mark, you're going to go with those guys in this room, and we literally split everybody up, and they go away and do goals and action steps for a while and come back. And they begin to, by doing that, they begin to see, this could really happen. Oh my gosh, I can't wait to get this going. And they really, really buy in. After the advance, then we'll recruit and research and really figure out which one we're supposed to do first.
Yeah.
Okay? And then after the first year, you can try the second one. So here's what the voting looks like. We put them up there in clusters because somebody will say Maple Elementary School, somebody else will say so-and-so high school, and we're going to say, you know what, those are all school related, so they all go in the school cluster. Somebody else says we should adopt the firehouse on 4th Street. Somebody else thinks we should do on 10th Street. We put those together. And you vote by cluster. Okay? And then we research later and figure out which is the best one. So here's our last thing we do. After we've decided what we should do, we talk about strategic values, how we're going to show up and do it. What values do we need to exhibit to make our initiative work out? So here's some sample ones. Action, generosity, innovation, right? So if I had more time, I'd make you all come up with a whole bunch of those. I'm just going to wrap this up quickly. But you actually put those on the wall as well. And so we then actually vote on the strategic values. We consolidate the list down by table. We rank them in order of importance. And here's what it looks like. They vote again by column. So anything in the column that's something to a sacrifice or giving ourselves away goes in that column. Anything about love is in this column. Anything about boldness is in this column. So we've collected all these ideas and values in different words, put them in columns, and everybody gets to vote. And we pick the top 6. And I pull the rest down. And then there they are. This church has chosen to live like this in the world. It's a beautiful ending to the whole experience. And the pastor then can walk back through this. Okay, church, if we've chosen risk-taking, and this is what it means. And if we've chosen, grace or generosity or whatever, and it's a really fun exercise to end the whole process. Okay? So, they've looked at disciple making in the process. What does God want to do? How can we live amongst the lost in a redemptive way? We've figured out values, how we're going to minister in the city. After advance, the missional leadership team, which is probably your 10, 12, 15, 20 key people running the whole process, they're going to pulse all these discoveries with the groups that couldn't make it. So you're going to have little groupings, whether maybe some of the choir folks couldn't make it, so you have a little choir pulse group. And it's a way to present all the findings and get some feedback, and you do that to the whole church, so that everybody feels like they've heard and or touched this thing in some way. Okay? You modify whatever you need to. Then we write the mission plan, which is essentially about a 10-page report of all the learnings, and now these are the implications, and here's what we should do. And that is presented to the board.
Love it.
And then you have a retreat, and the board and the mission leadership team work it all out, and they own it and take it, and off we go. And we have a whole manual, a 100-page manual we've written to walk you through all the steps of this thing. They present it to the board, negotiate, they get underway, we implement different ways this is shown up. This church was going to do RVQs to those who are struggling, who live in their recreational vehicles in the city. So they do barbecues for them every weekend. And that church has been doing that for over 10 years. The pastor has long left, onto something else, and this got so embedded in their DNA, they still do it. And they're loving those folks into the kingdom. This church is doing a ministry to those who are on the street corners of the Home Depots who are doing day labor stuff. They minister to them every week. And they bring them into the kingdom. The Lawndale Care Center, same kind of thing. Mentoring, schools. What would it look like for your church to live into that kind of behavior and to be known as the people who live in the city, pray for people in the city, and live like Jesus. It grows them up, cities become transformed, disciples are made. So, these are the outcomes. Individually, you get clarity and calling and action steps to get it going. And corporately, you're figuring out the city, the needs, how we can meet those, and we start initiatives to presence Jesus. That, my friends, in 3 hours, is the missional pathway.